New York City, 1961. In the thick cigarette smoke of Little Italy, where whispers travel faster than bullets, a quiet man held the Mafia's darkest secret. Elias Romano, 35, was not a killer. He never carried a gun, never raised his voice. He balanced books, moved money, and wore the same gray suit every day. But then, he started knowing who would die. Before anyone said a word, at first it was subtle. A name on a ledger would shimmer. A date would echo louder than the rest. Elias kept it to himself, until one night he handed in the numbers, and the man whose name he circled was found dead the next morning. Execution style. The bosses called it intuition. Elias called it a curse. As the bodies piled up, Elias's mind began to slip. He dreamed of blood dripping between the lines of his ledgers, of faceless men whispering through the static of his radio, and always, of a black door in the basement of his building. A door that wasn't there the day before. Now, he's not just predicting deaths, he's hearing them. And when a name he's never seen before appears in his books, his own, Elias realizes the final hit may already be ordered. But who wrote it? If numbers could whisper secrets, would you dare to listen? Follow the story of Elias Romano, the accountant who saw the blood before it was spilled. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and don't miss the next chilling chapter, because some debts aren't paid with money. Chapter 1. Numbers Don't Lie, New York City, 1961. A bitter November wind swept down Mulberry Street, sending discarded newspapers dancing across the pavement. The neon lights of Little Italy flickered against rain-slicked streets, casting red and green shadows on the faces of passers-by, hurrying home before darkness fully descended. In a narrow second-floor office above Russo's bakery, Elias Romano sat hunched over columns of numbers. The space was small but meticulously organized, ledgers arranged by date on wooden shelves, 3 sharp pencils lined perfectly parallel on the desk blotter, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light in the otherwise dim room. The scent of fresh bread and pastries wafted up through the floorboards, mingling with the smoke from his lucky strike. Elias was 35. Though the permanent furrow between his brows and the silver threading through his dark hair made him appear older. His fingers, stained yellow from nicotine, moved deftly across his ledger, recording numbers that represented much more than simple transactions. Each entry was a story. Protection money from the butcher on Spring Street, profits from the card games in the back room of Salvatore's, payoffs to certain police officers who looked the other way. Mr. Romano. A voice startled him from his concentration. Elias looked up to see Tommy Mancini, a young runner for the Lucchese family. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, with a thin face and anxious eyes that darted around the office, never settling in one place for too long. "What is it, Tommy?" Elias asked, his voice soft but precise, each word measured like the numbers in his books. "Mr. Lucchese wants the books from last month. Says he needs them tonight." Tommy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Elias nodded, reaching for the leather-bound ledger on the corner of his desk. As his fingers touched the cover, something strange happened. The ledger felt unusually warm, almost hot to the touch. When he opened it, the name Vincent Calabrese seemed to shimmer on the page, the ink appearing darker, more pronounced than the surrounding text. Elias blinked, rubbing his eyes beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. He must be more tired than he thought. "You okay, Mr. Romano?" Tommy asked, noticing his hesitation. "Yes, fine," Elias replied, closing the book and handing it over. "Just tell Mr. Lucchese that the Calabrese numbers might need a closer look. Something doesn't add up." Tommy nodded and tucked the ledger inside his jacket. "Will do. My ma says you should come for Sunday dinner sometime. Says you're too skinny." A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's face. "Tell your mother thank you." "Maybe someday." After Tommy left, Elias sat back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. The strange sensation lingered in his fingers, and Calabrese's name echoed in his mind. Vincent Calabrese owned a profitable gambling operation in Queens, and rumor had it he'd been skimming from the family for months. Elias had noticed discrepancies in his payments, but hadn't mentioned them to anyone yet. The telephone on his desk rang, cutting through his thoughts. He picked up the receiver. "Romano speaking. Elias, it's Sal. Turn on your radio." Elias reached for the small Zenith radio on his bookshelf and tuned it to the news station. The announcer's voice filled the room. found dead in his Queens apartment this evening. Police are investigating what appears to be a gangland-style execution. Vincent Calabrese, a local businessman with alleged ties to organized crime. The receiver nearly slipped from Elias's hand. When did this happen? About an hour ago, Sal replied, his voice low. The boss wants to see you tomorrow morning, early. Elias hung up and stared at the radio as it continued to detail the murder. Calabrese had been shot twice in the back of the head. No witnesses. No suspects. The room suddenly felt colder. Elias's mind raced back to the strange occurrence with the ledger. He'd seen Calabrese's name shimmer before knowing about his death. A coincidence, surely. It had to be. Numbers were real, tangible. They didn't predict murders that night. Sleep eluded him. In his modest apartment on Mott Street, Elias lay awake, listening to the sounds of the city. Distant sirens, occasional shouts, the rhythmic dripping of his kitchen faucet that no amount of tightening could fix. When he finally drifted off near dawn, he dreamed of ledgers filled with names written in shimmering ink, and blood seeping between the lines of his perfect columns. If this story of mysterious premonitions and the dark underbelly of 1960s New York has captured your imagination, consider subscribing to join our community of storytellers and listeners. Your support helps bring these characters to life, one chapter at a time. Chapter 2. The pattern emerges. The next morning, a thin grey light filtered through the Venetian blinds of Elias's apartment. He stood before his bathroom mirror, carefully knotting his tie. Navy blue with subtle pinstripes, the same one he wore every Wednesday. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of his restless night. The walk to the Lucchese family's social club on Hester Street was familiar, each step automatic after years of the same routine. Elias nodded to Mrs. Esposito, sweeping her stoop, tipped his hat to Father Donovan outside St. Anthony's, and avoided the puddles left by the early morning street cleaners. The rhythmic click of his polished Oxfords against the pavement steadied his nerves. The club was housed in a nondescript three-story brownstone. Despite the early hour, two broad-shouldered men flanked the entrance. They nodded to Elias, a man so deeply embedded in the organization's financial machinery that his presence was as expected as the sunrise. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of espresso and cigar smoke. Antonio Lucchese sat at his usual corner table, silver hair slicked back, fingers adorned with gold rings that caught the light as he gestured. At 72, he maintained the commanding presence that had elevated him from street thug to crime boss 5 decades earlier. Elias, Lucchese said, his voice gravelly from years of Cuban cigars. Sit. Elias slid into the chair across from him, hands folded neatly on the table. You mentioned something about Calabrese's numbers to Tommy last night, Lucchese said, studying Elias's face. How did you know? Elias swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The book showed irregularities. He'd been shorting his payments for months. I was going to bring it to your attention today. Lucchese leaned back, a thin smile creasing his weathered face. Yet you specifically mentioned him last night, hours after he'd been dealt with. A coincidence, Elias said carefully. I had no knowledge of what happened to Calabrese. Lucchese studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've always had good instincts with the numbers, Elias. That's why you're valuable. That's why you're still here when others are not. He pushed a small espresso cup toward Elias. Drink. You look like you haven't slept. Elias took the cup with a slightly trembling hand. Thank you, Mr. Lucchese. I need you to look at some other operations. See if you find any irregularities. Lucchese slid a folded piece of paper across the table. These 3. Report directly to me. Elias pocketed the paper without looking at it. He knew better than to examine it here. Back in his office, Elias locked the door and unfolded the paper. 3 names, Marco Gentile, Peter Rossi, and Frank Baldini. All were involved in different aspects of the family business. Gentile ran numbers in the Bronx. Rossi managed several loan operations in Brooklyn, and Baldini oversaw a string of nightclubs in Manhattan. Elias pulled their ledgers from his shelves and began his meticulous examination. Pencil in hand, adding machine at the ready. Hours passed as he lost himself in the familiar comfort of numbers. Concrete, reliable, honest in a world built on lies. It was late afternoon when he noticed it again. While reviewing Baldini's books, The nightclub owner's name suddenly appeared to shimmer on the page. Elias blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the effect remained. Baldini's name pulsing slightly as if illuminated from within the paper itself. A cold weight settled in Elias's stomach. He set down his pencil and walked to the window, needing air. The street below bustled with the normal activity of Little Italy. Women shopping for dinner, men congregating outside the local barber shop, children playing stickball in a narrow alley. Normal life continuing, unaware of the darkness Elias navigated daily. He returned to his desk and stared at Baldini's ledger. There were no financial irregularities that he could find. The nightclubs were profitable, and Baldini's payments to the family were consistent and on time. Yet something about seeing the man's name shimmer filled Elias with dread. That evening, as Elias walked home through the gathering dusk, the neon signs of restaurants and bars flickered to life around him. A black Cadillac crawled slowly down the street, its engine a low purr. Elias quickened his pace, turning down a side street to avoid it. In his apartment, he heated a can of minestrone soup and ate standing at his kitchen counter, listening to a Sinatra record playing softly on his phonograph. The music usually soothed him, but tonight it couldn't dispel the unease that had taken root inside him. The telephone rang, startling him so badly that he knocked over his soup spoon, splattering tomato broth across his countertop. "Hello," he answered, his voice tighter than usual. "Turn on the radio," said Sal without preamble. With a sense of déjà vu, Elias switched on his radio and tuned it to the news station. The announcer's voice crackled through the speaker. Breaking news from Manhattan. Frank Baldini, owner of several popular nightclubs, including the Blue Note and Starlight Room, was found dead in his car this evening near the Hudson River. Police are treating it as a homicide. The room seemed to tilt around Elias. He gripped the edge of his counter to steady himself. "Elias? You still there?" Sal's voice came through the receiver. "Yes," Elias managed. "When did it happen?" "About an hour ago. Word is he was talking to the feds. Lucchese wants to see you again tomorrow." After hanging up, Elias sank into his armchair, his mind racing. This was no coincidence. Somehow he had known about Baldini before the man was killed, just as he had with Calabresi. But how? He was an accountant, not a fortune teller. He dealt in facts and figures, not premonitions. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Elias heard something strange, a faint tapping coming from somewhere in his apartment. He rose, following the sound to his small home office. On his desk lay the ledger he'd brought home, open to Baldini's page. In the moonlight streaming through the window, the ink seemed to move, the numbers rearranging themselves before his eyes, and beneath his desk, where there had only been solid floorboards before, Elias could now make out the outline of what appeared to be a small trapdoor. Elias backed away, heart pounding. He was losing his mind. He had to be. In the world of concrete reality he'd built for himself, a world of precise numbers and orderly ledgers, there was no room for shimmering names and mysterious doors. Yet, as he returned to his bed, pulling the covers tight around him, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The numbers were trying to tell him something, and whatever it was, he feared the message was written in blood. Chapter 3. The Ledger's Secret. The following days passed in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. Elias moved through his routine like a ghost, wake at 6 a.m., dress in one of his 5 identical suits, walk to the bakery for coffee and a plain roll, arrive at the office by 7:30. The familiar pattern that once provided comfort now felt like a prison of routine, each minute ticking toward some unknown but inevitable conclusion. In his meetings with Lucchese, Elias reported on the remaining names from the list, Gentile and Rossi, finding no financial discrepancies. He said nothing about the shimmering names or his growing dread. What could he possibly say? That he was seeing visions? That would be a death sentence in itself. The city seemed to close in around him. The narrow streets of Little Italy, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze with no exit. Each face on the sidewalk, each slow-moving car, each unexpected noise triggered a surge of panic. Was he being watched? Had they somehow discovered his strange ability? Elias found himself checking over his shoulder constantly, startling at shadows, avoiding the gaze of men he'd known for years, sleep, when it came at all, was plagued by nightmares, ledgers whose pages turned by themselves, names that glowed like neon signs, and always the sense of being hunted, of running down endless corridors of numbers that shifted and rearranged themselves before his eyes. His mother called from Rhode Island on Wednesday, concerned by the strain in his voice during their weekly conversation. "So you're working too hard, Elias," she admonished gently. "You sound exhausted." "I'm fine, Ma," he lied, watching the rain streak down his apartment window, painting wavering lines on the glass. "Just a bit overworked. You need a nice girl to take care of you," she said, as she always did. "Mrs. Petrocelli's daughter is divorced now, you know. Very pretty, very good cook." The familiar conversation provided a moment of normalcy in a world that was rapidly spiraling beyond his comprehension. Elias found himself wishing he could tell her the truth, not about the family business, which she tactfully never mentioned, but about the strange phenomena he was experiencing. Would she believe him? Or would she simply make the sign against the evil eye, as she had when he was a child and spoke of monsters in the closet? On Friday afternoon, a week after the Baldini incident, Elias sat alone in his office, rain pattering against the windows. The streets below were quieter than usual, pedestrians hurrying through the downpour under black umbrellas that bobbed like beetles against the grey cityscape. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery mingled with the musty smell of old paper and ink that permeated his office. He found himself staring at the ledgers on his shelves, wondering which one might next reveal a name marked for death. The telephone rang, breaking his reverie. It was Lucchese's consigliere, Carlo Venucci. "Elias?" Carlo's smooth voice came through the line. "The boss needs you to look at another operation. Guy named Moretti runs some protection rackets in Hell's Kitchen." "Heard of him? Anthony Moretti?" Elias asked, leafing through his mental catalogue of family associates. "Yes, I've seen his payments in the books." "Good. We need you to go through his numbers personally tonight. He'll be at the Red Rose Club at 9. Private room in the back." This was unusual. Normally, Elias worked from his office with associates bringing him the books. "Is there a concern with his operations?" A pause. "Can just do your job, Elias. 9 o'clock. The line went dead before he could respond. Elias replaced the receiver with a trembling hand. Something wasn't right. The family rarely conducted business in public venues like the Red Rose Club, a popular night spot, known for its jazz acts and wealthy clientele. And why send him, the accountant, to meet directly with Moretti? It was a breach of the carefully maintained hierarchy that kept the family functioning smoothly. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of heightened vigilance, jumping at every sound: the slam of a car door on the street below, the creak of the building's old pipes, the sudden burst of laughter from the bakery downstairs. At 6, he locked his office and walked home through the persistent drizzle, his mind churning with possibilities, none of them good. The rain had intensified, drumming against the sidewalks and creating miniature rivers along the gutters. Water seeped through the worn soles of his Oxfords as he navigated puddles that reflected the neon signs of restaurants and bars preparing for the Friday night rush. Few people were on the streets now, most having sought shelter from the downpour. Those who remained hurried with collars turned up and hats pulled low, anonymous figures in the gathering darkness. In his apartment, he changed into a fresh shirt and his second-best suit. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he noticed how pale he looked, almost spectral. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened, giving him a haunted appearance. Was this what fear did to a man? Slowly eroded him until only a shell remained? The strange tapping sound had returned, coming from his small home office. Despite his fear, Elias followed it, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The sound led him to his desk, where the ledger he'd brought home lay open, though he was certain he'd closed it before leaving that morning. Under the warm glow of his desk lamp, a name shimmered on the page: Anthony Moretti. A cold sweat broke out across Elias's forehead. This meeting wasn't about reviewing Moretti's books. It was something else entirely. His eyes drifted to the floor where the outline of the trapdoor had become more distinct. It was no longer just a suggestion in the wood, but clearly visible now. A square panel with a small iron ring at one corner. The tapping seemed to be coming from beneath it, a soft, insistent rhythm like fingertips drumming on the underside of the floor. Against every instinct telling him to leave it alone, Elias knelt and pulled the ring. The trapdoor opened with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for him all along. A rush of cold air escaped from the dark space below, carrying with it the scent of old paper and something metallic. Blood? Within the small compartment lay a single item, another ledger, older and bound in faded red leather. The cover was worn smooth in places, as if handled frequently over many years. No title or marking distinguished it, yet Elias knew immediately that it was significant. He lifted it out with trembling hands, the leather cool and oddly heavy against his palms. The tapping stopped the moment he touched it, plunging the apartment into an unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and his own shallow breathing. Sitting at his desk, Elias opened the red ledger. The first pages were filled with names, dates, and locations, all in his own neat handwriting, though he had no memory of creating this book. The entries stretched back decades, long before his time with the Lucchese family. Each name was followed by a cause of death. Shot twice back of head, strangled, Hudson River, heart attack, poisoned, car accident, brake lines cut. Elias turned the yellowed pages with growing horror, recognizing some of the names, old enemies of the family, informants, rivals, who had mysteriously disappeared over the years. This was more than a financial record. It was a death registry, a meticulous accounting of the family's darkest business. But how could his handwriting appear in entries from the 1930s and 40s before he was even born? And why couldn't he remember writing any of this? The final pages were blank except for 3 entries. The first 2 were complete. Vincent Calabrese and Frank Baldini, both with dates matching their recent deaths. The third entry contained only a name and a date. Anthony Moretti, October 17, 1961. Tonight. Elias staggered back, the ledger slipping from his fingers to the floor. This couldn't be real. He was either losing his mind or something impossible was happening. Something beyond the rational world of numbers and balance sheets he'd built his life around. He picked up the red ledger again, examining it more closely. The binding, though worn, was expertly crafted. The paper was high quality, each page precisely cut. Running his fingers over the handwritten entries, he could feel slight indentations from the pressure of the pen. These were not printed or reproduced. Each name had been written by hand, one by one, a careful accounting of lives ended. And now Anthony Moretti's name had appeared, with tonight's date. The implications crashed over Elias like a wave. This wasn't just about perceiving deaths after they'd been ordered. The ledger wasn't simply recording history, it was predicting it. Or perhaps more terrifyingly, it was creating it. Either way, Anthony Moretti was marked to die tonight, and somehow Elias was connected to this grim process. His handwriting the instrument of record, his presence requested at the scene. The clock on his wall read 8:15 p.m. He had a choice to make. He could go to the Red Rose Club, play his part in whatever was planned for Moretti, and continue as he always had, the quiet accountant who saw everything and said nothing, the man who balanced the books while others balanced the scales of the family's brutal justice. Or he could act on this knowledge. Warn Moretti, break the pattern that the Red Ledger had established over decades. But what if he was wrong? What if this was all some elaborate delusion born of stress and fear? He'd be risking everything, his position, his life, on what might be nothing more than an hallucination. Elias poured himself a finger of whiskey, downing it in one burning swallow. The alcohol did little to calm his nerves, but it helped clear his thoughts. He'd spent his life working with facts, with verifiable numbers that added up neatly in black and white. Now he was faced with something he couldn't quantify, couldn't balance in any ledger, yet the pattern was undeniable. Calabrese, Baldini, both dead after their names appeared to him. And now Moretti. By 8:45, Elias had made his decision. He stood across the street from the Red Rose Club, rain soaking through his overcoat despite his umbrella. The club's crimson neon sign reflected in puddles at his feet, rippling with each drop of rain. Inside, through steamed windows, he could make out the shapes of patrons drinking, laughing, dancing to the muted strains of a jazz quartet. Somewhere in there, Anthony Moretti was waiting for him. And if the Red Ledger was to be believed, Moretti would die tonight. The warm, inviting light of the club contrasted sharply with the cold darkness of the rain-swept street where Elias stood watching. It seemed symbolic of the choice before him, the comfortable warmth of routine and obedience versus the cold, dangerous unknown of defiance. Elias's hand drifted to his breast pocket, where he'd placed the folded page torn from the mysterious book. He'd spent the last hour making telephone calls to his elderly mother in Rhode Island, to his estranged brother in Boston, and finally anonymously to the police, reporting suspicious activity at the Red Rose Club. A black sedan pulled up in front of the club, and Elias recognized Carlo Vannucci stepping out, accompanied by two broad-shouldered men in dark overcoats. They entered the club without looking around, moving with the confident stride of men accustomed to fear and respect. Taking a deep breath, Elias crossed the street. He had a role to play, perhaps the most important one of his life. Inside the club was warm and hazy with cigarette smoke. The scent of expensive perfume and cologne mingled with the sharper smells of whiskey and gin. A jazz quartet played on a small stage, the mournful wail of a saxophone floating above the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses. Well-dressed patrons crowded the bar and filled the tables, their faces flushed with alcohol and the heat of too many bodies in too small a space. The maitre d', recognizing him as family business, nodded toward the back room without a word. Elias made his way through the crowd, his heartbeat nearly drowning out the sultry voice of the female singer who had taken the stage. Couples swayed on the dance floor, locked in each other's arms, oblivious to the deadly business about to transpire just steps away. In the private room, Anthony Moretti sat at a round table nursing a whiskey. He was a bull of a man with a square jaw and thick fingers, adorned with gaudy rings. His expensive suit strained slightly at the shoulders, evidence of his physical power. Despite his size, there was an intelligence in his eyes that belied the stereotype of the muscle-bound enforcer. Carlo stood behind him, while the two bodyguards flanked the door, their expressions impassive but their eyes alert, constantly scanning for threats. "Romano," Moretti greeted him with a nod. "Heard you're good with numbers." "That's what they tell me," Elias replied, taking the seat across from him. He set his briefcase on the table and clicked it open, revealing ledgers and papers. "Shall we begin?" Carlo moved to the door. "I'll leave you two to discuss business. Take your time." The look he gave Elias carried a clear message. "Do your job." As soon as the door closed, Elias leaned forward. "Mr. Moretti, I believe you're in danger." Moretti's expression hardened, the affable businessman replaced instantly by the street fighter who had risen through the ranks of the organization. "What kind of game is this, Romano?" "No game. The family suspects you of talking to the feds. They sent me here to go through your books, but that's not the real purpose of this meeting." Elias slid the folded page across the table. "You're marked for death tonight." Chapter 4. The accountant's reckoning dawn broke over the city, painting the eastern sky in streaks of pale gold and lavender. The night's rain had ceased, leaving the streets glistening and the air unusually clean, scrubbed of the usual urban grime. Steam rose from manholes like ghostly apparitions, dissipating in the cool morning breeze that carried the promise of autumn. Elias sat in a corner booth at an all-night diner in the Bowery, far from Little Italy, and the familiar streets that had been his world for so long. His suitcase rested beside him, his hat pulled low over his eyes. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with henna'd hair and lines etched deeply around her mouth, refilled his coffee without asking. It was his fourth cup since midnight, the bitter liquid long since having lost its ability to sharpen his exhausted mind. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a couple of night shift workers finishing their meals before heading home, and a solitary cab driver hunched over a plate of eggs at the counter. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow over the worn linoleum and chipped formica tables. A ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, occasionally catching on a dead spot with a soft click, before resuming its rhythm. Elias hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep. Every shadow, every stranger entering the diner sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. His nerves were stretched to breaking point, his body operating on pure survival instinct. The events at the Red Rose Club replayed in his mind in vivid detail. Moretti's face when he showed him the ledger page, the sudden intrusion of the police, the chaos that ensued. The envelope Moretti had given him lay hidden in the lining of his suitcase. Insurance. Yes, but also a death sentence if Lucchese's men found him with it. Elias had examined its contents in the taxi, that brought him to this anonymous diner. Bank statements, transaction records, photographs of meetings with known officials. Everything needed to dismantle the Lucchese family's operations and send its key members to prison for decades. He checked his watch, 6:17 a.m. He'd been sitting here for nearly 4 hours, postponing the inevitable decision about where to go next. Rhode Island, to his mother's small house near the coast. Boston, to the brother he hadn't spoken to in years. Or somewhere entirely new, where no one knew Elias Romano, the quiet accountant with ink-stained fingers and a talent for numbers. The small radio behind the counter played the morning news, the announcer's voice competing with the sizzle of bacon on the grill and the clatter of plates. Elias listened with half an ear, until a familiar name cut through his exhaustion. Anthony Moretti, alleged organized crime figure, was taken into protective custody late last night. Sources say Moretti has agreed to testify against prominent members of the Lucchese crime family. In related news, police conducted raids on several businesses associated with Antonio Lucchese, including the Starlight Lounge in Manhattan and a warehouse in Brooklyn. Multiple arrests have been made, though authorities declined to name specific individuals at this time, so Moretti had made it to the feds. The ledger had been right. His death had been averted. But what about Elias's own name, which had appeared in the book? What did that mean for him? The bell above the diner door jingled as a newspaper delivery man entered, dropping a stack of fresh papers on the counter before departing. The waitress placed one on Elias's table without comment. The headline confirmed the radio report. Crime family targeted in dawn raids. Beneath the fold was a smaller headline that made Elias's blood run cold. Gang accountant sought for questioning. There was no photograph, thankfully, but the article mentioned an unnamed financial expert believed to have crucial information about the family's operations. They were looking for him, both the police and, undoubtedly, Lucchese's remaining men. He was caught between two forces, neither of which offered safety. Elias paid his bill, leaving a generous tip, and stepped out into the morning. The city was coming to life around him. Delivery trucks rumbling down streets, shopkeepers raising their shutters, early commuters hurrying toward subway entrances with collars turned up against the chill. He walked aimlessly for a while, letting the rhythm of his footsteps clear his head. The weight of the mysterious red ledger seemed to pull at him, though he'd left it hidden beneath the floorboards of his apartment. That ledger connected him to something he couldn't explain, a power or knowledge that transcended normal understanding. And somehow it had chosen him, marked him as its keeper. By noon, Elias had moved to a small hotel in Midtown, registered under his mother's maiden name, Calabro. The room was sparse but clean, a single bed with a faded floral coverlet, a wooden chair by the window, a small dresser with a radio atop it. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the telephone on the nightstand. He'd been turning a plan over in his mind all morning, weighing risks against necessities. The rational, cautious part of him, the accountant who had survived in a dangerous world by keeping his head down and his mouth shut, argued for fleeing the city immediately. But another part, perhaps awakened by the mysterious ledger, pushed for a different course of action. If he ran now, he'd be running forever. The family had long arms and longer memories. Finally, he picked up the receiver and dialed. Federal Bureau of Investigation. New York Field Office. "I need to speak to whoever is handling the Moretti case," Elias said quietly, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Tell them it's about Antonio Lucchese." The connection crackled as he was transferred, put on hold, transferred again. Finally, a brusque voice answered, "Agent Daniels, I have information about the Lucchese family. Detailed financial records going back 5 years." A pause. "And you are?" "Someone who kept the books." Another pause. "We should meet. In person." 2 hours later, he sat across from Special Agent Robert Daniels in a nondescript room at the FBI field office. The building itself was imposing, all glass and steel. But this particular room could have been in any office anywhere. Beige walls, functional furniture, a water cooler in the corner. The only distinguishing features were the lack of windows and the tape recorder on the table between them. Daniels was a square-jawed man with crew-cut hair the color of straw and penetrating blue eyes. He had the patient, watchful demeanor of someone accustomed to waiting for confessions. For the moment when resolve crumbled and truth emerged, Mr. Romano, Daniels began, his voice neither friendly nor hostile, you've taken a significant risk coming here. Why don't you tell me what you know? Elias pushed Moretti's envelope across the desk. Financial records. Every illegal operation, every payoff, every murder ordered by Lucchese for the past 5 years. He paused, feeling the weight of years lifting as he spoke. I kept the books. Daniels opened the envelope, eyes widening slightly as he scanned the contents. His professional demeanor cracked momentarily, revealing genuine surprise. This is comprehensive. It's my life's work, Elias said with a bitter smile. I can verify every entry. I can testify to the authenticity of these records. You're offering to testify against Lucchese? Daniels leaned forward, his interest palpable. I understand what that means. I do. Elias removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose where they'd left indentations. The constant vigilance, the lack of sleep, the strain of the past days, all were taking their toll. I want protection, and a new identity afterward. That can be arranged. Witness protection program. We've moved others before you. Daniels tapped his fingers on the envelope. But I need to understand why now. You've been with the family for what, 10 years? 12 years. And suddenly you decide to turn. What changed, Mr. Romano? Elias considered his answer carefully. He couldn't explain the ledger, the premonitions, the names that shimmered with deadly significance. Daniels would think he was crazy or worse, complicit in the deaths he'd foreseen. Let's just say I developed a conscience, he said finally. Daniels didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. We'll need you to make a formal statement. It's going to take time to process everything here. He gestured to the envelope. And to set up your protection. As Daniels outlined the witness protection program, Elias's mind drifted to the mysterious red ledger he'd left hidden in his apartment. What would happen to it now? Would it find another keeper? Another accountant with a talent for seeing the patterns in numbers in men's lives? The truth was, Elias didn't understand it himself. Was it some kind of supernatural intervention? A psychic ability that had suddenly manifested? Or was it something else entirely? A manifestation of his own subconscious, perhaps, putting together patterns and clues his conscious mind had missed. He'd been the perfect accountant because he saw patterns in numbers that others missed. Maybe that ability had extended beyond the ledgers, into the dangerous web of relationships and power plays that constituted the family's business. Maybe he'd always known who was marked for death, and his mind had finally found a way to make the knowledge conscious. Mr. Romano? Daniels's voice broke through his thoughts. Are you with me? Yes, sorry, just processing everything. I understand. This is a big step. Daniels closed the envelope and stood. We'll get started with your formal statement. Then I'll have my team go through these documents. If everything checks out, we'll move you to a safe house tonight. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, formal statements recorded on the clacking tape machine, and detailed questioning about the family's structure and operations. Elias provided names, dates, amounts, all from memory. Numbers had always been his strength, his anchor in a turbulent world. Now they were his salvation, his ticket to a new life. By evening, Elias had been debriefed, his statement recorded, and arrangements made for his protective custody until the trial. Multiple agents had verified key elements of his testimony, confirming his value as a witness. The machinery of justice had been set in motion, grinding slowly but inexorably toward Lucchese and his lieutenants. As he was escorted to a safe house in a nondescript government sedan, the city lights blurred through rain-streaked windows. The rain had returned with nightfall, as if washing away his old life. Elias felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The family, what remained of it, would hunt him relentlessly. His only protection now was the very system he had helped Lucchese evade for years. His old life was gone. Elias Romano, the quiet accountant in the grey suit who balanced the bloody books of the Lucchese family, would soon cease to exist. In his place would be someone new, someone without the burden of all those names, those deaths, those columns of numbers that translated to human suffering. What would his mother say if she knew? Would she cross herself and thank the saints that her son had found redemption? Or would she turn away, ashamed to have raised a son who lived so long in darkness? And his brother, estranged after their father's death. Would he understand that Elias had taken this job, this life to ensure that his family would never want. That the blood money had paid for his mother's comfortable home, his brother's college education. The safe house was located in a quiet residential neighborhood in Queens, the kind of place where families lived ordinary lives, untouched by the darkness Elias had navigated for so long. The house itself was nondescript, a small two-bedroom with aluminum siding and curtained windows, nothing to distinguish it from 1,000 others like it. Inside, the furnishings were sparse but functional: a sofa, a dining table with 4 chairs, a small television in the corner. The kitchen was stocked with basic provisions, enough to last several days. 2 agents would remain with him at all times, Daniels had explained, until they were ready to move him to a more permanent location. "You should try to get some sleep, Mr. Romano," said one of the agents, a young man named Thompson, with an earnest face and a wedding band that gleamed under the overhead light. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Elias nodded, but knew sleep would not come easily. Not with Lucchese's men hunting for him, not with his name written in that mysterious red ledger. He wondered what his entry would say in the cause of death column. Would it remain blank now that he had changed his course? Or was his fate already written, as immutable as the columns of numbers he had balanced for so many years? As midnight approached, Elias sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cooling coffee before him. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the soft ticking of a wall clock. The agents had taken shifts. Thompson now slept in one bedroom, while the other, Morris, kept watch in the living room. Morris was older, more weathered, with the watchful eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness. Elias found himself thinking about Tommy Mancini, the young runner whose mother had always invited him for Sunday dinner. He hoped the boy would find a different path, away from the family and its blood-soaked business. Perhaps Tommy could use his talent with numbers for something constructive, something that built rather than destroyed. A sound from the bedroom made Elias turn. Thompson emerged, but something was wrong. He moved stiffly, his face pale, his hand pressing against his side where a dark stain was spreading across his white shirt. "Run!" Thompson gasped. Before collapsing to the floor, Morris leapt up, drawing his gun, but it was too late. The window behind him shattered with a crash of breaking glass, and he fell forward, struck by a bullet from outside. Elias froze, terror paralyzing him. The safe house had been compromised. Somehow Lucchese's men had found him. Then, survival instinct taking over, he dove for the floor as more shots peppered the apartment. The television exploded in a shower of sparks. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling where bullets struck, and the wall clock shattered, its hands frozen at 12:07, crawling on his stomach. Elias made it to the kitchen, taking cover behind the counter. His heart hammered against his ribs, blood roaring in his ears. He had no weapon, no training for this kind of situation. He was an accountant, not a soldier. The front door burst open with a splintering crack. Through the gap beneath the counter, Elias could see polished black shoes entering the apartment. He recognized those shoes, handmade Italian leather from a small shop on Mulberry Street. Carlo Vannucci's trademark. "Romano," Carlo called, his voice eerily calm in the aftermath of violence. "I know you're still here. Let's not make this messier than it needs to be." Elias's mind raced. The apartment had another exit, a fire escape through the bathroom window. If he could reach it, he began inching toward the hallway, moving as silently as possible across the linoleum floor. From the living room came the sounds of Carlo searching, overturning furniture, opening closets. "The boss is very disappointed in you." "Elias," Carlo continued, his voice carrying easily in the quiet apartment, "you were trusted, part of the family. And family doesn't betray family." The word family twisted in Elias's gut. Lucchese had used that term often, wrapping his criminal enterprise in the language of loyalty and tradition. But there had been nothing familial in the cold calculations of profit and loss. In the ledgers filled with names of the dead, Elias reached the hallway and rose to a crouch, preparing to make a dash for the bathroom. The door was just 10 feet away, partially open. Beyond it lay escape, a chance at survival. "You know what happens to rats, don't you?" Carlo's voice was closer now, taking on a harder edge. "They die in the dark, alone. No one mourns a rat." Heart-pounding, Elias sprinted for the bathroom door. Behind him, he heard Carlo shout, followed by the crack of gunfire. Pain exploded in his left shoulder, spinning him against the wall, but adrenaline pushed him forward into the bathroom. He slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock as bullets splintered the wood around him. The pain was intense, radiating from his shoulder down his arm. He could feel warm blood soaking through his shirt, running down his side. But he was alive, and as long as he was alive, he had a chance. With his good arm, Elias wrenched open the window and climbed onto the fire escape, the cold metal slippery beneath his fingers. Behind him, the bathroom door gave way under Carlo's assault. Elias descended as quickly as he could, his wounded shoulder screaming with each movement. Above, Carlo appeared at the window, taking aim. More shots rang out, pinging off the metal around him. But Elias kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. The fire escape shuddered beneath him, the old metal protesting under his weight and the impact of bullets. 3 floors up, 2-1. Elias could see the alley below, dark and narrow but promising escape. Reaching the bottom, he dropped to the alley below, landing awkwardly and nearly falling. Pain shot through his ankle, but he pushed through it, forcing himself to run. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond escape. All he knew was that he had to get away, had to survive long enough to testify. He zigzagged down the alley, making himself a harder target, even as he heard Carlo's heavy footsteps on the fire escape above. The alley opened onto a quiet residential street. At this hour, all the houses were dark, their occupants asleep, unaware of the life and death drama playing out on their doorsteps. Elias turned right, running as fast as his injured body would allow. The pain in his shoulder was becoming unbearable, his vision blurring at the edges. Blood loss and exhaustion were taking their toll. He stumbled once, twice, forcing himself back to his feet through sheer willpower. He turned down another alley, then another, trying to lose any pursuit. The sounds of the city at night surrounded him, distant sirens, the rumble of the elevated train, music spilling from a late-night bar. Normal life continuing while his hung in the balance. Rain soaked him to the skin, washing away the blood that trailed down his arm. The cold helped clear his head, but it also sapped his strength, his body temperature dropping dangerously as he continued his desperate flight. Eventually, his strength failing, Elias collapsed in the doorway of an abandoned building. The world spun around him, darkness encroaching on his consciousness. As he slipped toward unconsciousness, a strange thought occurred to him. Perhaps this was what the ledger had foretold. Perhaps this was his death, written in that mysterious book. But as his eyes closed, another image replaced the ledger, his mother's face, kind and worried. His brother, with whom he'd reconnected after years of silence. And, strangely, Tommy Mancini's mother, who'd invited him to Sunday dinner, saying he was too skinny. Connections, relationships, the things he'd denied himself in his isolation, in his world of numbers and ledgers. The humanity he'd set aside to become the perfect accountant, the keeper of bloody books. With the last of his strength, Elias pulled himself to his feet. The pain was distant now, his body numb from cold and shock. But his mind was suddenly clear, focused on a single thought. He would not die here in this doorway. He would survive. He would testify, and somehow he would start again, not as an accountant for killers, but as someone who used his gift for patterns to build something better. Stumbling back into the rain-slicked street, Elias flagged down a passing taxi, leaving a smear of blood on the yellow door as he pulled it open. "Hospital," he gasped to the startled driver, a turban-wearing Sikh whose eyes widened at the sight of his bloodied passenger. "Please." As the taxi pulled away, Elias looked back, expecting to see Carlo in pursuit. But the street behind them was empty, washed clean by the relentless rain, as if his old life had been erased, leaving only blank pages waiting to be filled with new figures, new calculations, new patterns of existence. Chapter 5. Balance Sheet, Phoenix, Arizona. 1963. The desert sun beat down on the quiet suburban street, heat rising in visible waves from the asphalt. Edward Collins, formerly Elias Romano, watered the young palm tree he'd planted in his front yard, enjoying the simple pleasure of nurturing something that would grow over time. His left arm still ached when rain was coming, a permanent souvenir from Carlo Vannucci's bullet. The physical therapist said he'd regained almost full mobility, though certain movements would always be painful. A small price to pay for survival, Edward thought. 2 years had passed since the night he'd fled through the rain-slicked alleys of Queens, since he'd testified against Antonio Lucchese and watched the old man's empire crumble under the weight of federal prosecution. Lucchese had received 3 consecutive life sentences. Carlo Vannucci had fled the country, rumored to be hiding somewhere in South America. The family that had ruled Little Italy for decades was now scattered, its power broken, and Elias Romano no longer existed. Edward Collins was an accounting professor at a small community college, living in a modest house with a view of distant mountains. His neighbors knew him as a quiet widower from back east, private but polite. No one questioned the occasional nightmares that woke him shouting in the early hours, or the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings for threats that never materialized. Inside, his home reflected his new life, bright desert colors instead of the muted grays and blues of his New York apartment, photographs of Arizona landscapes on walls that had once been bare, books on subjects beyond balance sheets and tax codes. The only remnant of his past was a small black notebook where he kept a private ledger, not of deaths or criminal enterprises, but of small kindnesses. A record of the good he tried to put into the world to balance the years he'd spent enabling evil. On this particular Saturday, Edward graded papers at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. The normality of it still surprised him sometimes, how quickly extraordinary circumstances could give way to ordinary life. The doorbell rang, startling him. He wasn't expecting visitors. Cautiously, he approached the front door and peered through the peephole. A young man stood on his porch, early 20s perhaps, with familiar features that Edward couldn't immediately place. Not a federal marshal. They always called before checking in. Not one of Lucchese's men. They wouldn't ring the bell. Against his better judgment, Edward opened the door, keeping the security chain engaged. Professor Collins. The young man smiled nervously. "You probably don't recognize me. I'm Thomas Mancini." Tommy. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Tommy Mancini, the runner for the Lucchese family, the boy who'd delivered ledgers whose mother had always invited Elias for Sunday dinner. "How did you find me?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't easy," Tommy admitted, "but I'm good with numbers too." Always was. "I tracked some patterns in the witness protection financial arrangements. Nothing obvious, just inconsistencies that made sense if you knew what to look for." Edward's mind raced. If Tommy could find him, others could too. "Why are you here? Did Lucchese send you?" Tommy shook his head. "Lucchese's finished. I'm not with the family anymore. After everything fell apart, I went back to school. I'm studying accounting, actually." He smiled sheepishly. "You inspired me, Mr. Romano. The way you kept everything balanced, how you could see patterns nobody else could." Edward stared at him, searching for any sign of deception. "You came all this way to tell me you're studying accounting?" "No." Tommy's expression grew serious. "I came to warn you. Carlo Vannucci is back in the country. Word is he's looking for you." A cold weight settled in Edward's stomach. How would he even know I'm alive? The official story was that I died in that safe house. Rumors spread. And Carlo. He never believed you were dead. He's been obsessed with finding you. Tommy hesitated. There's something else. Something strange. Edward unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." Inside, Tommy sat at the kitchen table while Edward made fresh coffee, his mind whirling with implications. His peaceful existence in Arizona suddenly felt as fragile as a mirage. "What's the strange part?" Edward asked, setting a mug before Tommy. Tommy reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "This came to my mother's house a month ago. Addressed to you." He slid it across the table. The envelope was worn as if it had traveled far. Edward's name, his real name, Elias Romano, was written on the front in elegant script. No return address. With unsteady fingers, Edward opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same quality as the pages from the mysterious red ledger that had revealed the pattern of deaths. On it, a name was written in shimmering ink. "Carlo Vannucci. What is this?" Tommy asked, watching Edward's face pale. Edward didn't answer immediately. The red ledger had disappeared the night he fled New York, left behind in the hotel room he'd never returned to. He'd convinced himself it had been a hallucination, born of stress and fear, that the premonitions had been coincidences, or his subconscious connecting dots his conscious mind had missed. But now, Holding this paper, he wasn't so sure. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Did anything else come with this?" Tommy nodded. "A newspaper clipping about a heart attack. Some banker in Miami died suddenly at his desk. I didn't understand the connection." Edward felt a chill run through him. The pattern was repeating. The ledger, or whatever force had created it, was still at work. "Tommy, you need to go back to New York. Today, it's not safe for you to be associated with me." "But Carlo, I'll handle Carlo." Edward stood, his decision made. "There's a pattern at work here, and I think I finally understand what it means." After Tommy left, Edward packed a small bag. He'd been running from his past for 2 years, but perhaps that had been the wrong approach. The ledger, the premonitions, they hadn't been a curse. They'd been a responsibility. He'd been given the ability to see deaths before they occurred. Not to profit from them, not to facilitate them, but to prevent them. 3 days later, Edward sat at an outdoor cafe in Miami Beach, watching the entrance of an Art Deco hotel across the street. The heat was oppressive, humidity clinging to his skin unlike the dry heat of Arizona. He'd been there for hours, nursing cups of coffee, waiting. When Carlo Vannucci finally emerged, Edward almost didn't recognize him. The once immaculate consigliere looked haggard, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, his hair streaked with grey. 2 years of hiding had taken their toll. Edward followed at a distance as Carlo walked along the beachfront. Despite everything, he felt a strange calm. The pieces were falling into place, the pattern completing itself. When Carlo turned down a quiet side street, Edward quickened his pace. "Carlo," he called. Vannucci spun around, his hand automatically reaching inside his jacket. When he saw Edward, his eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed with cold hatred. "Romano," he hissed. "I knew you weren't dead." "I'm not the man you knew," Edward said, maintaining his distance. "That life is over." Carlo withdrew a gun from his jacket. "Not yet, it isn't." Edward didn't flinch. "Before you pull that trigger, there's something you should know. About patterns. About ledgers." "Always the accountant," Carlo sneered. But curiosity flickered in his eyes. "You received a warning about a banker who died of a heart attack," Edward said. "A man named Phillips. You thought it was a message from a rival." Carlo's gun hand wavered slightly. "How could you know that?" "The same way I knew about Calabresi and Baldini before they died. The same way I know about you." Edward took a step closer. "Your heart, Carlo, it's failing. You've been feeling the symptoms for months, but you're too proud to see a doctor." Fear flashed across Carlo's face, not of Edward, but of something more primal. His free hand moved unconsciously to his chest. "The episodes are getting worse," Edward continued. "Shortness of breath, pain radiating down your left arm, dizziness." "Shut up," Carlo snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not here to kill you. Carlo, I'm here to save your life." For a long moment, the two men stood facing each other, the accountant and the consigliere, bound by a history of blood and numbers. Then slowly Carlo lowered his gun. "How?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "There's a hospital 3 blocks from here. They have one of the best cardiac units in the country." Edward gestured down the street. "You can shoot me or you can live. Your choice." Another long silence. The only sound, the distant crash of waves and the faint music drifting from beachfront hotels. Finally, Carlo tucked the gun away. "Why would you help me after everything?" Edward thought about the red ledger, about patterns and balance sheets, about debts and payments. "Because some books need to be closed properly," he said simply. They walked side by side to the hospital, 2 aging soldiers from a war neither had truly wanted to fight. At the entrance, Carlo paused. "This doesn't make us even, Romano," Edward nodded. "I know, but it's a start." As he watched Carlo disappear through the hospital doors, Edward felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting, a ledger balancing. The mysterious red book had given him a second chance, not just at life, but at redemption. Back in Arizona, weeks later, Edward Collins tended his garden in the cool of the evening. His mailbox contained a postcard from Miami. No message, just a picture of the Art Deco skyline at sunset. He understood its meaning. Some debts had been paid. That night, for the first time in years, he dreamed not of ledgers filled with names of the dead, but of blank pages waiting to be written. If this story of redemption and second chances resonated with you, please consider subscribing to join our community. Your support allows us to continue sharing these human journeys, stories of darkness and light, of patterns broken and remade, of the quiet courage it takes to begin again. Thank you for being part of this narrative.